Yeah, the digital frontier that we're looking upon. And Bitcoin kind of stands on that. And you're right. I mean, the attack on energy uses in general. It's not just Bitcoin. I mean, you see it against AI now. Just any kind of consumption of energy for any kind of new
Yeah.
technology. People are afraid of it. I mean, it's the same thing throughout history. And we brought up the Satoshi emails, and actually, that was one of the things that he answered in these emails. For anyone who doesn't know, as part of a court case that we'll maybe talk about too, there was a release of Satoshi emails that had never before been seen. One was with Anna Back, and one was more extensive with an early developer, Marty Malmy. And these were between like 2009, 2011. And you just get to see a little bit more about who Satoshi might have been as a person. You kind of get to see like how he thinks a little bit. So I found it really interesting. And one of them, he was asked whether Bitcoin is harmful for the environment. And Satoshi had a really interesting answer. He said, ironic if we end up having to choose between economic liberty and conservation. But he said proof of work is the only solution to make peer-to-peer eCash work without a trusted third party, and is fundamental to coordinating the network and preventing double spending. And then he said, unfortunately, proof of work is the only solution I found to make it work without a trusted third party. Even if I wasn't using it secondarily as a way to allocate the initial distribution of the currency, proof of work is fundamental to coordinating the network. If it did grow to consume a significant energy, I think it would still be less wasteful than the labor and resource intensive conventional banking activity it would replace.
Yeah. I wrote in my tweet storm on that. I think that by far Satoshi's like most fascinating new quote. I think, Satoshi is not a very eloquent person. And I think in, his public posts on the forums and in emails, he's very measured. And I think this is a really rare, because it's one of his first couple emails with, the contributor that got released here. It's very descriptive. He's talking about like choices that he made when building the network. A very rare kind of quote in the lexicon, and also very like eloquently worded. Right here we have this idea between choosing, he even at that stage where Bitcoin was worth nothing, was realizing that we might have to choose between liberty and conservation, that he was posing that question to society. I mean, again, I think it just gives you the level of like which Satoshi actually understood Bitcoin, right? I think that's one of the tensions like in the Bitcoin history, right? Is like, how much did Satoshi really know? Did he complete his work, or is it a work in progress that we have to complete? I would actually argue that's like kind of a fundamental fissure point in Bitcoin maximalism that people have different views on. But here we get that he was at least this wasn't like a silly putty thing where he stuck something in like, the vat and like something was produced, right? Like the system was built with a lot of intent. He looked at a lot of different ways to build it. And I think like what a powerful quote just in terms of, how much he says in so little space when, a lot of his writing is like highly technical and doesn't make that leap to being empathetic with the reader.
Yeah, no, it was very eloquently put, like you mentioned. And I thought, comparing it to the traditional banking system is a point that we say nowadays, but you didn't really hear it back then, where he talks about the cost, less than the banking fees, the brick and mortar buildings, skyscrapers, junk mail, credit card offers coming in the mail, he mentions.
I thought that was funny. Yeah, he does have a prior. I think it's worth noting he does have a comment about this that's roughly similar. So one of the funny things, I think the part of the emails that people are less familiar with is that Marty Malmy went by the code name Sirius. He was Satoshi's second kind of contributor. So once Hal kind of left and I think at that point he would have learned that he was diagnosed with ALS, right, and stopped contributing. And so Marty was the one who kind of takes it up.
He's
this, Finnish college student, 19 years old. So really a lot of their conversation though is because they actually created the forums together and because they actually launched the website and made the FAQ, a lot of their backroom dialogue is kind of them workshopping things that were published. So actually, even though we have 120 new pages of emails here, one of the interesting things is a lot of this is published in some way. So like myself, like I've gone back through and looked at the timestamp of like, okay, here's every instance of the Bitcoin.org website. So over 2 years when Satoshi was the kind of owner and operator of the project, how did their language actually change about how they were describing it? So what was interesting is, I was able to piece together from that and come together some like archaeological assumptions, right? You just see that at some point in 2010, he stops describing Bitcoin as anonymous, right? Early on, he talks about this a lot. He's open about how he thinks you can use Bitcoin with an anonymity. That's kind of gone. And there's an open question. Okay, well, was it Satoshi who decided to do that? Was this sort of just Marty kind of deciding to say, oh, I'm a marketer, I'm going to position this like a little bit differently? But here we see that it is actually Satoshi's decision. Satoshi kind of gives his, perspective on it. So in a lot of cases, like we know the results. You can kind of see if you like look back, you're like, okay, so this happened. There was a definitive thing here. But then what's the sort of this backstory? Like who of the two of them was particularly involved, and then what does that say about Satoshi? So that's like the level of granularity that when I was reading these emails, I was making. Because essentially, like, I'm very familiar with the public record, which is, there's emails out there, right? There's other developers who have released emails with Satoshi, and Satoshi did, I think in total write a couple thousand messages in the forums, right? So there's a pretty robust set of literature of him answering different things. But here, what's interesting is you get to see like some of these big moments, like what's the behind the scenes. So like, did Satoshi actually know that he had kind of failed to make Bitcoin anonymous, right? Or did he always think that that was kind of a hope, but he didn't know, right? So getting even a small detail like that, I think, is important because, again, as Bitcoiners are trying to keep up the network, I think interpreting what Satoshi would have wanted is a big kind of tension point, right? So
yeah, or does it matter? I mean, do you think it matters what Satoshi wanted when there's no way of knowing? I mean, maybe he foresaw like how Bitcoin would evolve over time, but I mean, he would have to have crazy foresight. But do you think it even matters what Satoshi may or may not have wanted all the way back in 2011, given that Bitcoin has changed a little bit since then? Do you think that matters?
Well, I mean, obviously, I think his opinion matters because we know that he was such a particularly talented and great individual, right? So he was somebody who understood the current science at the point that Bitcoin was invented so well that he made a net new invention, right? Like he changed the world by doing something that no one believed could be done. So you have to kind of like put it on that level. So it's like, to what extent would you like think that person's opinion is important? Well, they did the thing that was, we talk a lot about how great How was, or how great Nick Szabo was, or maybe even some of these other cypherpunk icons. But again, like Satoshi will be the one that endures because he is the person who figured it out. And so history generally, when it kind of reduces over time, you're left with kind of these great figures, right? Like Satoshi is the Edison of, what Bitcoin becomes. So, essentially then the tension point is, are we bound to what he thought about things? I think Bitcoin has answered that question, right? The Bitcoin development community has largely moved past Satoshi and kind of, is now well into kind of rewriting his software, well into, his idea of how Bitcoin would scale has been pretty thoroughly debunked in terms of like, it wasn't a valid way to approach the project, or there wasn't a consensus that the project should scale that way. But then we're left with something new, right? Which is that somebody else has to become the next kind of great inventor, right? And so where do you start? I think you start at the same place Satoshi did, which is, you go to the relevant literature. Here in his emails with Adam Back, we get a greater understanding of specific papers that they discussed. Obviously, Adam Back's emails, for somebody who's, was really hoping for this to be a treasure trove, a little bit disappointing. Adam kind of just he left Satoshi on red, like Satoshi him and he didn't even read his paper, right? Like, I like think about that as a funny kind of thing right now, where the great person kind of approaches you with a great idea, and you just Adam Bath had to go to the bathroom, he had to go walk the dog, there's just so many other things he was doing at the time. He was super busy, and just didn't get back to him, right? And it's funny now to look at that interaction, but wish there were more in there. But we do get a level of specificity of like, papers that they discussed. But I do think it's important, right? Satoshi, I mean, however you want to paint the Bitcoin story, right? And I do think there's different ideologies that paint it differently, right? In the Bitcoin maximalist world, our view is that Satoshi's invention is, either complete or we have to complete it, depending on your flavor of maximalism that you prescribe to. In the crypto world, their view is that Satoshi was great, but they had to do all these other things to reinvent and really unlock the potential of his things. And the no coiners are still rejecting his invention, right? So I like to categorize in that way because I think that great thinkers are often looked at differently depending on who you ask, right? Like in the crypto world, Satoshi is still venerated, right? You see the Bankless people like tweeting about Satoshi and like
Gary Gensler is even tweeting about how great he is.
Gary Gensler, big Satoshi fan. Yeah, great. I mean,
He's a big Satoshi
I
fan.
mean, yeah, I wonder with Gary Gensler, you're like, oh, this man was so great that he, you know, like, I had to spend years litigating everyone who was like investing in
It was
technology.
like Halloween. I think it was the white paper. You know, he was like, "This is the
Right.
anniversary of Satoshi's great paper."
Yeah, well, it's keeping him busy. You know, he's really been able to hire a lot of people. It's been a great time to be Gary Gensler since Satoshi was invented. You know, I think really his primary contribution to the world was just increasing the budget for the securities enforcement agencies of the United States. I think
Yeah.
it really swelled to record numbers under post Satoshi. It's been a great time.
The Adam Back emails were interesting. I thought the most interesting part was that Satoshi, I mean, maybe Satoshi is playing 3D, like 4D chess, and he did know what B money was, the way die paper. But in the emails to Adam, he says he doesn't know about it. And so what you can conclude is that anybody who did know about B money or talked about it previous to those emails are not Satoshi, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah, you never know. Like, so, Truth Bonsall was, like,
Yeah,
you
Drew
know,
was saying that.
texting
Yeah.
with Bill about this. Yeah, and it's like, you know, well, you never know. Like in chess, you know, are you playing the full move, right? Like, you know, there are people who use that same instance to say that, okay, well, maybe it was Wei Dai, because if it was Wei Dai, he wouldn't have cited himself, so maybe he made
That's
a
true.
mistake.
That's true.
There's so many levels of this that you can kind of like armchair quarterback, and this is where the Satoshi theories like kind of spin out of control. And kind of like, you know, or, you know, was it Adam kind of creating a paper trail with himself? You know, there's like, you know, you can never disprove everything. So whether, you know, how do you take it do you take it at face value, or do you kind of go into the conspiracy, kind of, or not conspiracy, I guess that word's been politicized, but like, you know, it's the theoretical, all the different potential realities, right? Well, which reality is your preferred Satoshi? But yeah, I would say the one conclusion that I've kind of come to on reading these, to be honest, is I think Satoshi was younger. I actually really, from seeing this extent of kind of correspondence from him, there's a few kind of remarks from this. He uses a couple words. I'm not sure if I can repeat them on this platform, but they're very like millennial-esque. You know, there's a word that begins with an R that he uses kind of casually that I thought was pretty funny. But you know, I think that and like thinking of him starting from Hashcash, right, as with that kind of idea, you know, and maybe not being familiar with some of the other literature, I often think that, like, you know, because I'm pretty sure, and I'm close to publishing a thread on this, but like I've always been pretty adamant that I don't think Hal Finney is Satoshi, right? Like I don't think that at all. And one of the reasons that I don't think that is I think it would have been very hard for somebody like Hal to like fake a conversation with somebody else who was also an expert and then have that conversation with other experts. Because if you think about like what would there, in a world where Hal Finney is Satoshi, the correspondence on the cryptography mailing list is him having a conversation with himself and then faking a conversation between experts among experts. And I think it's very unlikely that somebody who was that good at like one field, computer science, was also so good at dialogue, right? Like deception, character creation, writing, that he like created a fictitious character, created this like elaborate scenario with himself, like knew enough to like make him uneducated or like not leave any direct connection. Like there's just like so many like things that he would have had to have done to get that right, that it's just become super unlikely. So I think that yeah, the evidence here that that Satoshi is somebody
Younger.
who, you know, was maybe unencumbered by the extent of knowledge that Hal had, right? Because Hal did know every paper. He was the guy who tested every new digital cash project. And I mean, I've gone through Hal's archive. Hal tested everything. There's like a guy from 95 who has the software called Magic Money. Who's the first guy to download it? Hal. It's a guy with a pseudonym. The project doesn't even work. The software, you actually like, you control how much money you make, and like the other person can make as much money. Just like wacky systems, right? Like these are the flying cars of their era. You know, there's like in the late 90s, again, there was this other guy, anonymous, is called Trust Bucks, like, you know, another thing that like doesn't work. So Hal is like the perennial kind of first user, and he would have had this like body of just like understanding about it. And I often think that like when it comes to, you know, people doing great things, this is why you see a lot of great artists are usually younger, is they're kind of unencumbered by the past. They don't feel the need to like be respectful of like each and every idea, to like really weigh and consider, you know, all the options, like what is every single thing that went wrong. And you know, Hal's contribution, like previous to Bitcoin, would have been RPow, which was, you know, a very different type of network, didn't use Hashcash at all. There was like a central operator that was him, and that was kind of the sum of his ideas. And then sort of then a couple years later have a totally differentiated idea seems unlikely. And yeah, again, I don't know. I think like people who are younger are just, you're able to innovate with, when you think about your taste as a kid, like, not kid, but like maybe up until your 30s or something, like, what you like and what you hate. And the world is just like very black and white, like Satoshi feels like a person who's like, oh yeah, I like hash cash. And, yeah, I haven't even read this other stuff. Like, fuck that. I'm not even interested in that. Like I'm just going to go forward with my version idea. And then to have the confidence to like pull that off, right? Like you have to then believe that you can make a new monetary system. I don't know, like an older person, like I'm not sure would have been able to have that level of confidence and almost like chutzpah, you have to really believe in yourself.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost like those young startups who like, they wouldn't have even started if they were older and understood how difficult it would have been to be successful. But then they pull it off because they had this like confidence. And, well, I don't want to say ignorance, but like just kind of like, hey, we're gonna do this.
I think that's part of it. To be honest, like I think there is sort of like naivete would probably be the right thing, right? Like I think like Satoshi was like just naive enough to think that it could work, right? Like he had read the stuff and he was like, oh yeah, like, we choose between liberty and like energy resources. Great. Like, yeah, we'll choose liberty.
Yeah, obviously we choose liberty. Satoshi, he also, I think he used the word newbie in it as well. Which I was
there's a lot of those like kind of
like, I've never really heard a boomer, say newbie, you just don't really, but I think you're right. I think Satoshi will be remembered. He's the Prometheus who brought us fire. I also think about like, the greatest inventions spur on more inventions, like more inventors that are building on top of that invention. So like electricity, we talked about before, obviously, things like computers, like a blender, anything, all these inventions that spurn from the invention of electricity. It just makes you think like how many things are going to be built on Bitcoin. Maybe we don't even know what they'll be like, right?
Be careful. You might be, there might be some unorthodox ideas.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, look, I think so. I mean, I'd like to think that we're just still investigating what Bitcoin is capable of. I mean, obviously we know for sure some things, right? It's money that holds value over time. What's the limit of that, or how far can we go? Certainly there's a lot of developers who have been active and energized and are looking at new things. And to me, I mean, I try to go into that stuff with an open mind. I don't think there's any reason to kind of, be afraid of those kind of things. Satoshi himself, dabbled in this ideas that we could link networks of blockchains and, unite them with Bitcoin's hashing power. And, again, I think like we should never be like so sure of things to not try something else, right? Like if somebody does have a good idea, it would have been very easy for Satoshi to convince himself not to release Bitcoin, right? There were so many reasons, even on the thread, you can see the responses, where people really thought that like it was a net negative, right? Like even just suggesting the idea of using this much energy for a system that at that point could have functioned with like 3 computers, was actually offensive to some people. They were like, why did you do this? Don't do this. But yeah, I mean, look, I think there's a lot to dig into those emails. We also get some great moments about like Satoshi like needing a break and like kind of talking about how he's burnt out on the concept and like can't keep working on it, which I think is kind of humanizes him a little bit, whereas before he just kind of has unexplained absences. So yeah, I mean, I think the most mysterious kind of thing, I did a thread on this, but we see this kind of new thing where Satoshi has like a donor, or like he refers to like these mysterious donors that he was kind of like interacting with. That's kind of a big unexplored thread for me, where I thought that was like the most curious. Like if I was to highlight like one thing from this email set, that is really
right.
Like
they received like money to fund the website. Well, I forgot.
Yeah, so what happened, it seems, is that Satoshi says essentially that he has these donors, and again, they're not really introduced or explained, and that these donors are willing to give money to the project. And so in order to receive that money, he needs to get Marty to accept that money, because otherwise he'd dox himself, and it seems like he doesn't want to dox himself. But then there's this kind of weird like thing where it's like, okay, well, who are these donors? Like, are these people like offline who are chatting with Satoshi, like who are part of like the internet network of the forums, and or are these just people like he knows casually, like who are donors? Like it was a very confusing thing where it's like the first reference where you can kind of speculate that like, oh, okay, like did other people like know he was Satoshi? Like, because otherwise, how would he know donors? And like, how would they would have had to have known that he was connected to the project in some way, right? So like, what's his relationship with these donors? And they do funnel a payment of like $3,500 to him, right? So there's an actual
I remember reading that
payment they received. Yeah, and I wrote that, like, the cost basis of that donation, whoever the person made it, like, they could have bought like 60,000 Bitcoin or something. Like, the price was like 7 cents or something. So hey, if you're the US government, you're still sitting on a good chunk of that. So there's a lot of inventory there.
I was actually, yeah, because I mean the US government's sitting on, I think it's like 205,000.
Yeah, it's a lot. Yeah, it's the old Silk Road Bitcoin. Because you think like how much Bitcoin they had. Yeah. Oh yeah. Like if you go through the archives, it's like really wild. Like, Satoshi Dice sold for like 600,000 Bitcoin or something like he sold the site for that. And then I think like you look at the statements of records, because some of the early Bitcoin businesses, they would like publish on Bitcoin Talks. They would publish their like statements, like they would like publish monthly updates. And there was one, I think, from MPEX. It was like Marsha Popescu's exchange, where essentially like, their revenue per month is like 20,000 Bitcoin like, or something. Like, and at that point, it was like nothing.
Yeah.
But they really were dealing with it. And Marty actually tweeted about, just like, because in one of his emails he references like just sending 10,000 Bitcoin like very casually. And I think Marty is a really interesting figure because, if you think about somebody who's really important in the history, but like he was actually at Bitcoin Amsterdam. He was a speaker there, and it was funny. Like he was walking around, nobody knew who he was. I went up and we geeked out for like 20 minutes, but he's totally like receded in the background. But this is a guy who like performed the first US dollar to Bitcoin trade, like priced Bitcoin, like made one of the first large scale purchases, like bought an apartment with Bitcoin, like, could have been a billionaire if he sat and did nothing. But I think, yeah, there's an interesting thing with the new Satoshi emails where he is contra ethos to like the kind of hodling mentality of today, where you had to, if everybody had just sat around and hodled Bitcoin, like where would it have gone, right? Satoshi actually had to build the infrastructure. So this donation that came, it's like they used it to power one of the first exchanges, right? So you need liquidity to launch an exchange, and you need to have some sort of inventory, right? You need to buy the domain name. And so there really was, during the first era of Bitcoin up until 2013, like, there was this kind of go forth and like build and like give away. Like Gavin Andreessen with the Bitcoin faucet, right? Yep. He put 10,000 of his own Bitcoin and then allowed anybody to claim them. So they had a different relationship to Bitcoins, right? That like we can't fathom, because like to us it's very expensive. We look at it now and it's like, I checked it the other day, like Bitcoin is very close to flipping like the median household income. Like the median household income in the United States is $74,500. And so it's very, in the year of 2024, it's like buying a whole Bitcoin is uneconomical for the vast majority of people, even in like developed Western countries. That would be like a lifetime ideal for them. But back then it was so cheap and so unaffordable that like the podcast that I was talking about with VJ, where he talks about his introduction to Bitcoin, he like casually laughs about, he made a bet, he won 5 Bitcoin and he lost it. And, just never, they both laugh, and they're just like chuckling it out.
You just kind of have to laugh,